And we speak a lot about that topic because this is something without what the Ukrainian economy cannot develop anymore, and our society cannot develop. And that's what our future depends on. Now, topic, urgency and priorities for the reforms in Ukraine. We'll speak to our honored speakers, Roger Myerson, laureate of Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences 2007, Mr. Yuriy Logush, president of Kyiv School of Economics, and representatives of Vox Ukraine editorial board, Tymofiy, Mylovanov, and Olena, Bilan. Now, during this roundtable, during this press conference, we'll speak about reforms under conditions of crisis in economy and because of war in the east, and as a result of our roundtable, there will be proposals as to reforms, and in the form of an open letter which will be sent to the President of Ukraine, also to the Prime Minister. After we are done with the press conference, we'll give you phone numbers and contacts for more detailed to get more detailed information, and now we can begin. And I will invite our first speaker, Mr. Roger Myerson. I would like to remind he is an American economist, and who, together with Onion Gurwitz and Eric Maskinson, he received the Prime of Swedish Bank on Economic Sciences, and after Nobel, Alfred Nobel. Please, the floor is yours, Mr. Roger.
Maybe we can change this a little bit.
Yeah, I think we can change the line, and I think we can change this
тоді просто, щоб представити пана Myerson.
I would like to say a little bit about Kyiv School of Economics. That's the leading school of economics in Ukraine, and we organized a forum and comprehensive forum about the reforms and horizontal vertical reforms. And we work with the ministries and the civic groups. On February 24, a long time ago, but not a long time ago, there was an organization of Vox Ukraine. They founded, and the goal is to unite all the forces who work for the reforms and to prepare proposals, to give analysis and to support, to provide all academic support for the reforms to be precise, predictable, and good. And the colleagues will speak about that. And I will finish my short speech and invite Roger Myerson, who is Nobel Memorial Prize Nobel laureate, and he will speak about reforms to you. And the issue for today, also decentralization. We understand this is not a simple solution. One of the best economists on the planet, he will share his thoughts about this. Thank you very much, Mr. Myerson.
I am an economist who studies the specialty of game theory, which means I study how the rules of institutions affect the ability of people to build trust with each other and to cooperate effectively in markets and in politics, which means I read constitutions, for example. It was 7 years ago that I was first introduced to some of the unique and I think problematic features of centralization in the Constitution of Ukraine. 3 years ago, I wrote a piece in which I argued in response to something that Yulia Tymoshenko had written in Al Jazeera, that in understanding the difficulties of building successful democracy in Ukraine, and in understanding the difficulties that she was writing about of the challenges then facing the Arab Spring, which was the subject of her article in Al Jazeera, that one should not neglect the important questions of the distribution of power between nationally elected leaders and locally elected leaders. Decentralization needs to be an important question, I argued. It was not surprising to me that my article 3 years ago was not of any particular interest. I may be a senior economist of some reputation, but obviously I was writing about problems of other parts of the world. Today, the crises of Ukraine this year have made it have raised the questions, And I have no greater privilege as a senior economist than to participate in your discussions as a foreigner, and all I can do is testify some expertise that in thinking about reforms in this country, you need to think about what is connected with what. What kinds of structures in the Constitution, for example, have what kinds of effects and an economist should be helping to point that out for the discussions, and that's what I hope to bring here, and it's been a privilege to talk with people in Ukraine about this. My argument in brief was that I saw some important disadvantages of the system of decentralization in Ukraine. In particular, it's complicated, and I will only say a little bit. I can't say much now, but I want to say that the particular form of centralization in Ukraine was that since 2004, the Constitution has been written to give the Prime Minister, who's responsible to the Verkhovna Rada, give the Prime Minister primary responsibility for the national government, but gives the President primary responsibility for overseeing all local administrations. I have argued that when you think about that simple structure, having a popularly elected president whose greatest direct power is his ability to direct local administrations in some 24 different provinces or oblasts of the country and in districts, in hundreds of districts across the country, that structure itself tends to create a politics, a national politics, which is highly regionally creates is almost designed to create antagonism between regions. The most important connections I have tried to make were, one, that in countries that have decentralized democracy, let me back up and say, I was trying to respond to questions about when a country has successfully made a transition from an authoritarian rule to democracy, but the quality of democratic government still seems deeply dissatisfying to a large fraction of the voters. What's wrong? One of the best answers I can give to all countries, based on an analysis of the logic of constitutional democracy and on comparative politics across the world, is that in successful democracies, democratic competition at the national level is broadened by local democracy. Voters in many countries, when they look at at who are their candidates for national leadership who are taken seriously, in many countries, some of the best candidates are people who have proven themselves first by being elected as governor or head of a provincial administration or a large city, or mayor of a large city. In Indonesia, in Italy, in India this year, people who had previously been mayors of large cities or governors of important provinces became competitive presidents or prime ministers of the country, and that's typical. So the first argument I've tried to make is to recognize that one of the effects of decentralization would be to allow more opportunities for politicians to prove the quality of what they can do for the people of Ukraine by having been elected to responsible office at the provincial, municipal, or district level. The second major connection I'd want to make in this year of difficulty is to recognize that although decentralization seems to weaken the state in some ways, in some very important ways, a decentralization reform can actually strengthen a state against the problems of separatism or insurgency. When all power in a nation is allocated by a majority vote, democratically, but at the national level because the government is completely centralized, And even the decentralized offices in this country are under supervision of a president who is nationally elected by national popular vote. You raise the possibility, which I think you may have seen, that there may be a large portion of the country in which all the voters feel, all the citizens, the local leaders and the local voters en masse, feel that they did not participate in the coalition that chose the national government, and therefore they feel you can have regions where nobody feels they have any particular stake in the political system of the country. Decentralization, and by decentralization I typically mean most countries somewhere between a third and less than a half, somewhere between a third and a half of public spending is together at the provincial, district, and municipal levels, the sub-national level. In a decentralized political system, you guarantee that in every province there are local people, local leaders who are elected by popular support, therefore they have broad popular support in their communities, and they have broad responsibilities to spend public money to serve their communities, and therefore have a vested interest in the perpetuation, the preservation and perpetuation of the political system of this country, which is what it takes to resist separatist and insurgent. So that connection between better government at the national level from decentralization of government, the decentralization can make national political democracy more competitive, that decentralization can strengthen the political system against separatism, are two connections I want to make. We should recognize that there are vital interests that people at the national government have a vested interest in the current system, so decentralization is difficult. Let me say finally two sentences. One, that in a transition to a decentralization, the most important voices are not, of course, those of foreign professors, but of one of the national leaders who are going to, under the Constitution, write the reform. But I would hope that would be in dialogue, and the Ukrainian people should want to hear the voices of those patriotic representatives who are already elected, who have already been elected to provincial councils and district councils in all parts of Ukraine. The powers of their councils will be affected by a decentralization. They have an interest, and they should be part of the national dialogue in crafting the decentralization, the questions, in addressing the questions of constitutional reform for decentralization in Ukraine. Finally, I would say that, of course, a foreign professor has no vote. Foreign heads of state have no vote. And whatever the president of Russia may say, I would like to say that most of the arguments I have made to the benefits of democracy, of decentralized democracy, should also apply equally, or at least in some form, to Russia, that the Russian national democracy would be improved, I would like to say, if the December 2004 reform, which gave the president of Russia the power to appoint governors in Russia, that should also be a question that I hope the president of Russia will address when he talks about the virtues of decentralization in Ukraine.
Thank you so much, Mr. Myers. Я запрошую пана Мylovanova.
Thank you very much, Mr. Myers. I invite Mr. Mylovanov, Vox Ukraine. Thank you very much. One of the representative of Vox Ukraine editorial board. It's a group of economists and all Ukrainians, and we have 8 of us, and 4 of us globals. So they live and work in the US, so in Europe, and 4 are locals, very influential, very good reputation. Olena Bilan, Dmitro Solokub, Dmitro Berchuk, and Veronika Movchan. With global, so Yuriy Gornichenko, Volodymyr Bilotkach, and Alexander Talavera, and myself. We are trying to do the following. We want to raise the level of debates or discourse as to reforms in Ukraine. What is happening in Ukraine is there are a lot of discussions about reforms, but they are ad hoc. They're not systemic. There are some legislations, Nobody. There are discussions about around draft laws, and very often we don't see how they are linked with each other. That's why we're trying to bring people like Roger Myers, Jan Sveina, Ivan Miklos, John Rollins, people who from the West and who are working with us. We also wanted to bring people here in Ukraine who are the most influential and all stakeholders. And we would like to improve the discussion around the reforms. One of the events took place yesterday in Fox Ukraine Club. There was a group of people. We brought together representatives from civic groups, and we discussed the most urgent reform. And decentralization was one of them. Now I would like to give the floor to Olena Bilan, and she will tell you about the event we had yesterday. Thank you very much. The idea of the event yesterday and an open letter we would like to present to you. We'll publish it later. The idea was, we see that there is a feeling, we feel that there is no feeling of urgency of reforms in Ukraine. And there are a lot of talking, but not much done. 6 months went by after those tragic events, and but there is nothing happening, or very little is happening. And we all understand that Ukraine goes through the most difficult times, hard times during these years of independence. There's the war in the country, but the war must not become an obstacle to radical reforms. Me and my colleagues, we hear very often from some representatives of the government, we cannot do anything because there is the war in the country. No, quite the opposite. Our answer is, here and in other cities of Ukraine that do not take part directly in the war, they must work to improve our economy, because the aggressor will use any weakness of us, and they will try to destabilize our economy. Our answer must be, we must strengthen our economy by any means, and the most efficient method is reforms. What do we suggest? What do we call you for? We tell you we should not look for reasons why not to do. We should not look for excuses, but we should work quick, and for the reforms to start working. It's important to involve more people to the government, to government offices, and to reduce the number of this, because the government is like a bubble, and also the government should invite people with European experience, because other initiatives will go slow, or they will be sabotaged. In general, a list of reforms is very long. We can speak about how to define priorities among them. It's not the major task. The task is to involve as many people as possible who can do that, and we could start working on the reform. The approach should be systemic, because half steps will not change the situation. People and organizations who participated in our discussion yesterday, they are ready to provide maximal assistance, and they can bring experts, and some of them are working already on some issues, and they do well. It's not only a position of Vox Ukraine, but also it's a position of NGOs, quite known NGOs like Reanimation Package of Reforms, and representatives of New Country. They participate in the discussion. The representatives of an open dialogue, business associations, European business associations supported these initiatives. This is the position of NGO activists. So this is a position of a broad public, and I hope that we'll be heard and we'll be able to cooperate efficiently, and we'll be able to reform our country. Thank you. Yuriy, do you want to add anything? Yes, I agree with all. We work with Vox Ukraine quite closely, and many of them were in Kiev School of Economics, and we are sure that if we don't push fast and radically with reforms among people, people will not be happy with the government, and that will not help to stability. That's why it's very important that the government holds the mission which was given by people who lost their life on Institutska Street and in Kiev. It's very important that we will reform our country. We want to be in Europe, but first of all, we should be Europeans. We should have the form of governance which is built on the same values like they have in the EU. And we have to move fast, and then we'll cement, we will strengthen our country in this fight for freedom and independence. Mr. Roger.
As a foreigner from afar, a professor of economics, it's my job, as I say, to make connections. This country is facing deep questions about fundamental political reform, but it is also facing a deep military challenge to the existence of this country, and I would like to make a connection there. The question of defense of the sovereignty of Ukraine is a question of defending a political system. Ukraine, the people of Ukraine, and the culture and language are important, but the question of defense of the sovereignty of Ukraine is fundamentally a question of the existence of a sovereign political system, and the forces that are mobilized for its defense depend on people wanting to fight and sacrifice and risk their lives ultimately to maintain the political system of this country. There are, of course, important discussions about making sure that the courageous military forces of this country have the weapons that they need to defend the country. I want to suggest, although there are many reforms and we can argue about which are the highest priority, some aspect of reform is urgently needed as a weapon for the defense of the country. I want to suggest that one recognize that part of enabling the military and other forces to be mobilized to defend the sovereign existence of Ukraine relies on giving more people more faith that the political system of Ukraine is something which genuinely will provide benefits for them in the long run, and therefore is worth all those sacrifices. And in that sense, some part of reform, whether it's decentralization or some other aspect, should be considered by the nation and the leadership of this nation as being on the par of providing the weapons that are needed, the material that are needed to strengthen the forces that defend this country with such courage and valor.
Thank you so much, Mr. Myerson, for pointing out these specific areas to the focus. Я бачу, що пан Мylovanov ще хоче додати коментар.
I would like to express my personal opinion. It's not an opinion of Vox Ukraine or other people. There will be nothing to defend if we don't run reforms now. The country will just fall apart. And soon there will be elections, and I see that political process brings to the fact that people are afraid of reforms. They're waiting, they're playing, or they make deals with each other on political coalitions in the next parliament. That's why I don't want to swing the system. They don't want to risk the agreements. But our neighbor who is trying to press us down, to strangle us, they will use these elections, and they will use absence of reforms to prove to people in information warfare that nothing has changed with the new government. If they prove that to people, and If they see that it's not only, they speak only about new coalitions in the parliament, but in 6 or 7 months, nothing has changed. They just still take bribes. Bureaucrats still stop the process of providing weapons to our armed forces. They are afraid to take responsibility for weeks. And if people see that, and that nobody will want to defend the country, but because what to defend if the same, just the same quality of people replaced the previous ruling group? So Russia wants to prove that democracy brings nothing. They just oligarchs replace oligarchs. If Russia can prove that, if they can prove that, and then we'll have no democracy, we'll have no country. That's why I believe that we should run reforms now. And political elite and oligarchs, they have no other chance but just to take chance and responsibility and run the reform. It's not important what they do, but they must do something. For people to see changes by 20, you see, it doesn't matter what they do, something should change. If nothing changes, except people die for Ukraine, then I don't understand what's happening in the country. The government should understand, and they should mobilize to defend physically the country, but they should defend the country politically. That's why we need reforms urgently.
Olena wants to add. I would like to add to Tymofiy's words that we have similar feeling and similar signals which we received from our servicemen. Actually, Donbass battalion servicemen expressed very similar ideas. They say that nothing is improving, nothing new is going on in the country, and they want to push up these changes. In a moment, we will shift to Q&A session, and as a moderator, I would like to ask a question about the latest things which you discussed. Since we are going to have parliamentary elections in October, and this election campaign and voting will be held in line with the old election system, how do you think, under all these circumstances, won't this fact hinder the reforms? Is there any threat that we will have the same faces in the parliament, and whether we can expect them to vote for reforms? I do not believe that all the reforms should be voted in the parliament. I believe that we can start reforms just now. I'm very much convinced that we should immediately ruin this corruption system, this so-called telephone rule, when it is enough to call somebody who is in power and to offer bribe, and your issue will be resolved. Actually, Ukrainian constitution is excellent. It provides for many good things and for many rights for the citizens, and they suggest that this is not the legislation which should be changed. We should change the real structure of power, and the legal structure of power will be changed in the parliament, but we should start changing the real structure of power at the level of society, at the level of business, at the level of broad public. This civil society should be honest, and it should get rid of corruption itself. And actually, today we witness how this broad public has started to clear it up and to change. And that's why I believe that even today, both the president, the government have all necessary means, tools, instruments to take reform and to implement reforms today. Actually, they do not need so much new legislation. If the parliament does not want to work, the country should go forward anyway. Actually, in other words, you suggest that if there is political will, then we can change everything today.
Roger Myerson. My name is Alex. I'm a PhD in economy from Donetsk National University, working for Ukrainian Crisis Media Center, a spin-off project for communicating the reforms. And my question is about where is the balance between the quick wins that the Ukrainian economy and Ukrainian people expected and the strategy development that the government is arguing.
I'm sorry, what is the last sentence again?
Yeah, my question is where how to find the balance between the quick wins that the people are expecting right now, the urgency for reform, and the development of the strategy, of the vision, what to reform, how to reform, because the government officials saying, we're developing the strategy right now, and it is impossible to have the quick wins until we see where we are going.
So I've tried to argue that a well-crafted reform, fundamental political reform, should be viewed as part of the strategy for achieving reintegration of every part of this country effectively into a sovereign unity. I have argued that a decentralization which could be achieved very quickly in some aspect of it could be achieved very quickly simply as the president has promised by under the Constitution, the president can select anyone to be a head of government in a province or district, but there's nothing to prevent him from accepting the rule that that he will appoint whoever has the vote of confidence of a majority of the provincial or district council, even if they vote for someone who's in a party opposed to him. That's a rule which I understand he has promised to start implementing after the next provincial elections. That seems like a quick win. He could do it even quicker by using the tomorrow, or this afternoon, by making appointments of those councils where they are functioning. They already exist. What the people of this country want can only be achieved in the long term. We understand that. The proof that business as usual is over and that things are being done differently can be done. That is the quick win you're referring to. A journey requires a first step, and a journey that is a redefinition of the distribution of power in a country needs to begin with a step that is costly. If decentralization is to be the reform, the first step should be giving up central control of the local bureaucracies, and that could be done very quickly. In other dimensions, I can't speak. If other reforms are given priority, I wanted to argue earlier that some tangible reform that is fundamental to the power structure, whether it's decentralization or on some other dimension of government, should be viewed as a high priority.
Let me just add to that, if I may, because the Kyiv School of Economics, together with other agencies and donors, does a lot of policy work. And this is our experience so far. We've worked with a number of ministries. And it turns out that in every ministry, there's no one to do the necessary work to prepare reforms. Reforms aren't just simply you wave the magic wand and it happens. It's a human capital issue. And so ministers bring outside people who come in and work as volunteers or who get some support through donor organizations in order to design reforms that will work. Because you can easily be populist and create anything you want and then have a disaster afterwards. Reforms have to work in the way you want them to work. They can't work perversely. And that takes time. It's not easy to do. And the capital is missing. In every single ministry, for understandable reasons, you have people who are not reform-oriented, who have no concept of what reform should do, who've been doing things for decades in the same old way. The inheritance of the Soviet Union has been passed on in the cabinet of ministers to a new generation who work in the same way. And so you need all of the drive for reform, and the reformers are outside of government. They're outside of parliament. And so we hope that with the new elections, we will have new members of parliament and a new cabinet of ministers that will be formed that will be able to drive these reforms effectively. But the new ministers, just as the current ministers, and they may be the very same persons, will still not be able to effect reforms until you do a massive civil service reform, until you evaluate civil servants for their ability, for their intent, for their education, so that they can be drivers of reform. And of course, you need a much smaller government apparatus. We know that what we've inherited is a result of central planning and a totalitarian political system. You don't need this huge civil service. You don't need all of these government employees. You need quality. And that should happen. There's some effort at moving that direction, but you can't simply take and fire half of your ministry. They're protected. So you need civil service reform, and you need to bring fresh blood in. Otherwise, civil society will always be driver reform and always frustrated, and the citizenry will always be disappointed, and the wasted 20 years we have could turn into another wasted 20 years. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have another question.
Sergio Cantone from Euronews. I'm a journalist. I'm interested because there is anyway a central issue now in Ukraine, which is the Donbas one, is also one of the origins of the conflict. And there are talks about, of course, decentralization concerning especially this region. But there is also a very important, a huge reforming effort to take on in the Donbas. So what kind of reform, of economic reform, do you think the Donbas region need? And whether Ukraine, an economic reform in Ukraine, a comprehensive one, is viable without reforming the Donbas system? Thank you very much.
I can just answer that briefly. We know that Donbas is basically, in its current economic structure and political structure, is basically an extension of the Soviet period. People there live frozen in a different period of time, and its sense of a different reality has been reinforced by TV and media from the neighboring country, as we know. So Donbas needs to understand for the first time what freedom is, what liberty is, the ability to choose, to have a choice. If you're a worker in a giant metallurgical enterprise that has 50,000 or 100,000 employees, you have no choice. You go to work, you earn your wage, you come home, you watch TV, and you go to bed. The Donbas region needs to have, and you can see the signs of this, a balanced economy, a balanced society with a strong middle class, with small and medium business flourishing. In fact, it is this small and medium business and the middle class that has supported the Ukrainian government in Donbas. And it is the huge metallurgical and heavy machinery enterprises that have been the lethargic remnant of the past. So, and these are subsidized industries, incidentally. Everybody cynically argues that if these industries were to collapse, the state budget could be reallocated for useful needs. So a massive transformation, economic, social, political, has to be done in Donbas. People have to feel that they have authority, that they have democracy, that they have a voice, that they can make decisions, and it's no longer made by the owner of a huge plant or by a single monopolized political party such as the Party of Regions was in Donbas. One of the problems of Ukraine is that Ukraine, unlike the United States, doesn't have national political parties. They're highly regionalized. And the Party of Regions was a highly regionalized party. And incidentally, the president of Ukraine, the last one, who was extremely effective in introducing an authoritarian system, who knew how to use the levers of power, gained his experience as a governor of Donbass. And this goes back to Roger's point, that we need to have decentralization also so that we can have schools, that regions or oblasts can become schools for executive training for future presidents, governors who become presidents. We all laugh about Ronald Reagan. Remember Ronald Reagan, a Hollywood actor who became a great president? Well, he was governor of California. An extremely important experience, perhaps one of the most important, if not the most important states in the Union. So we need to have future presidents, we need to have executives in public administration and government who are responsive to people. We need to have people understand that government serves them. You know, this concept of we citizens want a strong state so we can serve the state is absolutely wrong. A strong state is needed to serve people. That's what government is for. That's what the state is for. And people in Donbass don't know that. In other parts of Ukraine they don't, but there particularly they don't. So I think these are the kinds of changes that have to be made in the future in Donbass and throughout Ukraine.
Yeah, but aren't you afraid that this decentralization that is being talked about now is not going to tackle really the economic reform that are badly needed in Donbass, as you said? And second point, aren't you afraid that Donbass could become a kind of Wallonia? I don't know whether you know the case in Belgium, where in the 70s there was this industrial reconversion, and it was a region of mining and steel making factories that were not economically viable then. Aren't you afraid about this possible negative outcome in this case?
Can I would like to comment on this. So, English is okay? Okay, so let's just be honest about this. We need to, first we don't know what's going to happen in Donbass in terms of the final outcome, in terms of the structure of the power. Will it eventually become separate? Will it become a part of Ukraine where the central government has absolutely no control, where they have special powers? Will there be really honest elections within the local councils or areas? All of those questions have to be resolved. There are very unpleasant scenarios which might realize, and there is a little chance, there is some chance, but not very high, that there will be a pleasant scenario in terms of final governance structure. Once that is clear, one could think about what is the economic prospects. Ideally, we should be preparing for all possible outcomes right now and have strategies in place that when there is an opportunity to move in and do something about economics too, then we are ready and we don't start thinking for the next 6 months about what we're going to do now. But honestly, we have to make a decision. Is this going to be a region that's worth developing? Being cynical about it. Let's look at historically, do we know of regions where there have been conflicts of this scale which have been redeveloped successfully? And what is the international experience tells us? Is it easier for us to relocate everyone, including industries and people, or is it easier for us to recover the industries and infrastructure? If we recover the industries, do we want to recover the industries which were there, or do we want to create new industries? So this kind of questions, which are not easy questions because they are related to redistribution of power and they can generate new conflicts among people. Some people stand to gain from this and some people stand to lose. It's easy to say we want to develop small, medium enterprises, but of course miners will be hurting if we are not paying them subsidies. If we are not paying them subsidies, they will be easily, there will be demand for populist policies. Whether they will be pro-Russian or pro-Ukrainian or pro-Belgium, it's unclear, but someone might capitalize on that. So this is extremely difficult questions which need to be taken seriously, and I sort of agree with you that the best we can do right now is to raise them, and we need to think seriously about them, but there are no easy answers.
Yes.
Thank you.
Political decentralization.
Політична децентралізація
and the questions of economic reform are in some sense logically separate issues. I understand, I cannot claim to have expertise on the Donbass economy. I understand that there have been a number of industrial enterprises there that have given many people there a better than average income, and that's a good thing. That's good for the welfare of those people, and Ukrainians should be glad of that. But I understand that those industries may depend actually on a variety of subsidies from the public budget of Ukraine, subsidies of below global prices on energy inputs that may ultimately be subsidies from Russia to Ukraine and to that region in particular. If the public budget is being spent in Ukraine to maintain industries that both the owners and the workers of these industries have some benefits, but if the benefits are considered at the, spending general funds that belong to everyone in Ukraine to support those industries, if they are truly, and I cannot say they are, but if they are truly dependent on such subsidies, then it is entirely appropriate to question those subsidies. If you have a totally centralized political system where it happens that the national government is controlled by a popular coalition elected by a majority of Ukrainians' votes, but majority that happens to be based in the western part of the country, and one of the plans for economic reform to spend the scarce public funds more efficiently is to cut off the subsidies that maintain the economy of the Donbass region. I can imagine that if there hadn't already been the kind of dangerous separatism that we already saw, it could be created by such discussions. So the ability to make economic reforms that cut subsidies in a crucial region may be politically easier once there is a genuine decentralization, so that they can be guaranteed that even if this loss is there, that some part of the public budget is being spent through the fact of decentralization by people who have been elected to office through the confidence of the residents of that region. So I would argue, while in some sense they are logically separate, and decentralization does not force economic reform of this sort, that political decentralization in the long term may make this kind of economic reform more feasible.
Let me just add that the Donbass region has been probably the most uniquely non-transparent region in Ukraine, and economists, including our economists at the Kyiv School of Economics, in response to our own curiosity and questions from others, have tried to take a look and to understand what is the real profitability of industries which were subsidized, and we don't know to what extent, and in which profits were not properly calculated, and huge amounts of money was transferred offshore from these industries. So we don't understand, number one, what really is happening in Donbass, and I think that we soon will. I'm one of those people who believes that everything will end up well, and that the European borders will not change. And secondly, we understand Ukraine also needs major infrastructural changes, upgrades, development. If you try to drive on the roads of Ukraine or travel as a passenger on the railroads of Ukraine, you understand the bad infrastructure, and that will require a considerable labor force, since these are considerably highly manual, labor-intensive efforts. So that I think that a developing, flourishing Ukraine will be able to absorb any workforce that is laid off from industries that are truly a disaster. In Wallonia, that was a problem. You had a highly developed economy, and there wasn't much absorbability for the labor force. In Ukraine, there was enormous absorbability of potential labor. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are extremely pressed in time, so we have to finish. Thank you so much, Mr. Myerson, for making it up to us. Mr. Logush, dear colleagues from the Fox Ukraine, we hope to see you again here and to have another meaningful discussion. And thank you so much again for your time. Шановні колеги, ми наш наступний прес-брифінг вже проводимо через 2 хвилини на тему волонтерської допомоги бійцям в зоні АТО. Всім, хто зацікавлений, дуже прошу розвернути ваші стільці, бо спікер буде знову з того боку. Дякую.